I think that for me, the most gratifying thing about following a writer's career from the early stories through the novels is that moment when you feel like they are in absolute full cylinder control of their craft. I was an early fan of Laura's and was enthralled by the stories, the world making and human difficulties of what the world will look like when all the water leaves us, An Isle of Youth. And her first novel, Find Me, it completely boggled me with its ability to be gloriously specific and gloriously huge all at the same time. I just could never get over that. But man, The Third Hotel, this is like the Laura Vandenberg book I dreamed of. It's like Laura Vandenberg fan fiction. It's so exciting. It is an artist in utter penetrating control of her own craft. I don't want to tell you too much about like the plot details, and I know that all of the glowing kind of rhapsodic reviews have probably given you that information, but I just wanted to say, to me, the most stunning thing about the work is the way it absorbs and metabolizes all of these diverse influences, from noir to feminist film fiction to Latin American fiction, and it creates this entirely new thing. It's strange and beautiful, but very solid in its own universe. It's really a marvel. And I can't think of a better person for Laura to be in conversation with tonight than Maud Casey. Maud is a great friend of the store, the author of a collection of stories and 3 novels, including The Man Who Walked Away. And she also teaches in the MFA program at University of Maryland. She's most recently the author of an amazing installment in the Grey Wolf Art of series. We have copies for sale in the front, and it's called The Art of Mystery. Like The Third Hotel, it tries to pull apart all of our assumptions about the unknown and how to write the unknown, and then to demand that we do the work of putting it back together again. But maybe they can offer us a little bit of guidance. Please help me welcome Maud Casey and Laura Vandenberg.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Maud. Thank you for the beautiful introduction. I'm so happy to be back at Politics and Prose. I lived in this area for a while, and I loved coming to this bookstore on a regular basis, and I miss it. So it's always nice to be back for a visit. So before Maud asked me all of her brilliant questions, I'm going to do just a very short reading from The Third Hotel. I'm going to read from the second chapter and tell you a little bit about the novel to contextualize the reading. The book concerns a couple named Clare and Richard is a horror film scholar, which is my secret dream job, for which I am wholly unqualified, but I still want to do it. Richard is killed suddenly in a hit-and-run car accident, and he had plans to go to a film festival in Havana, and his wife, Clare, ends up going in his place. So this chapter sort of begins to detail a little bit what was going on in their marriage and in Clare's life before his death. And I'm just going to read the first couple of pages of this chapter. In her former life, Clare was a sales rep for ThyssenKrupp. Her area was elevator technologies, and her territory was the Midwest. She liked the job because it involved an endless amount of travel to seemingly anonymous places. She had been to Nebraska 47 times. What was there to see in Nebraska? A surprising amount, really. She knew where to get the best steak in Omaha. When she cut into it, blood pooled on the white plate. She had seen dawn turn the plains as lustrous and vast as an ocean. Once, late at night, she parked her rental car on the side of the road and walked into a cornfield. She stood on a dirt path, surrounded by dark stalks, and imagined a harrowing chase through the corn that culminated in her murder at the hands of a masked killer with a knife. In the night sky, she spotted the red flash of planes through gossamer clouds, and if she listened very carefully, more carefully than she had listened to anything in months or maybe even in years, she was able to make out the dull roar of their passing. She got back into a rental car and drove away and wondered if this was what people meant when they talked about mindfulness. Early in her career, she learned that one of the most important rules of travel was this: The answer to nearly everything could be found in the signs. This way to baggage claim, this way to the ticket counter, this way to Cleveland, this way to Omaha, this way to the hotel bar. Travel was one of the few arenas in life where clear and correct direction was so readily at hand. Lately, she had been tasked with selling a new kind of cable to find hotels and high-rise office buildings and factories. This cable was made of carbon fiber and allowed elevators to travel twice as fast as they could with steel. They lived in New Scotland, a town on the outskirts of Albany. In their condominium, she kept a small rolling suitcase in the bedroom closet, stocked with miniature toiletries, exercise clothes, an inflatable neck pillow, and the books she brought with her on every flight, but could never seem to finish. The Two Faces of January by Patricia Highsmith. It wasn't an especially long novel, but on planes she could only read a few paragraphs before the words filled her with a crippling and inexplicable dread, driving the book back down into the depths of her shoulder bag. It was not so much the story that unsettled her, but the hidden things she sensed quivering under the surface. Subtext, she supposed this was called, and she did not care for it. Every time she saw her suitcase in the bedroom closet, tucked behind a mesh laundry bin, she imagined it was waiting for her second secret self. She traveled so frequently, it was not uncommon for her to wake in the middle of the night and think for a moment, where am I? She did not find this disconcerting, even when it happened in her own bed, but once she made the mistake of mentioning those midnight thoughts to her husband, and he looked at her like she was terminally ill. The travel had long been a point of contention between them. Why bother being married if you're always leaving? A reasonable question, and she couldn't say that she had an answer beyond the demands of her work. She wanted to be married and she wanted to leave. The two did not seem mutually exclusive. She had this second secret self that she didn't know how to share with anyone. And when alone, that self came out into the open. In the months before his death, her husband's own secret self started coming out into the open too. She could only assume this other self had been waiting inside him all along. The year of the great change. He was the same, and he was different. The way he looked when asleep changed. His face used to be smooth and expressionless, almost mask-like, but then one night she found him sleeping with lips parted into a wide, unsettling smile. He switched coffee mugs, trading out the Exorcist for the ghoulish face of Michael Myers. He was newly skittish around dogs. He stopped adding salt to his food. He stopped eating bananas. His pace on the sidewalk changed. He used to be a brisk, impatient walker, and then one day he began moving so slowly and contemplatively, it was as though every tree branch was a source of wonder. Claire struggled to imagine what, 40 years into a life, would cause a person to suddenly change the way they walked. There were alien, interminable silences when she called from the road, and when she was home, he took long, solitary strolls in the evening hours, a symptom that would eventually lead to his demise. Another symptom. He started demanding to know what she did on the road, how she accounted for all those hours alone, no matter how many times she told him the simple truth. In a hotel room, her favorite thing in all the world was to switch off every light and everything that made a sound, TV, phone, air conditioner, faucets, and sit naked on the polyester comforter and count the breaths as they left her body. Naked, her husband would shout, as though she had provided him with damning evidence. He had been an angry person for as long as she had known him, but it was a secretive anger. Most people found him loose and lighthearted, easygoing. That was the word people used, and in time she became suspicious of anyone who could be described in such terms. What was so easy about going? Naked and alone, she would say back, naked and alone. As a married couple, they'd had perfect years and they'd had shit years, but she had never in her life experienced a year that so thoroughly dismantled her with confusion. On her next trip, she thought about what he would see if he ever were to trail her on the road. A woman marking up sales reports with a pink highlighter. A woman watching workout infomercials with the volume on mute. A woman eating room service quesadillas in the bathtub instead of reading that novel she claimed to be nearly finished with. A woman doing a little exercise routine, squats and sit-ups, bicep curls with bottled waters, completed with the hope that he would notice the smooth lines when he put his hands on her body. A woman breathing naked on the toilet seat. A woman breathing naked in an armchair. A woman breathing naked before the bathroom mirror in the kind of lighting that could make a person reconsider every choice they had ever made in life. A woman breathing naked in the dark. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
I love that section, and it's a great place to start, I think, because it exhibits the complexity of Clare. And one of the things that I so admire about this book is that with Clare we get this character who is so many things and is really kind of thinking muscularly on the page. And at one point she says of her husband, I believe, that knowing someone was not a stable condition. And I feel like you really achieve that with Clare as well. And I wonder if you might talk a bit about how you worked with the mystery of her character, both in terms of the things that get answered and the things that don't, and how that was important to you.
Thank you, Maud. And some of you might know, and if you don't, you definitely should. Maud's amazing book, The Art of Mystery. So there's no one that I would rather be discussing mystery and character with. Yeah, I think, I mean, that was certainly one of the ambitions of the book, to explore how knowing another person is not a stable condition. And I think also knowing yourself is not a stable condition, where our understanding of our capacities, what matters to us, the thing that we would always do, the thing that we would never do, that can shift as our circumstances shift. So I was interested in exploring that in sort of a self-relational way. Also. But Clare I worked on this book, on and off, and with different sort of levels of intensity for about 5 years. And my understanding of her really, she was a character that it was this very long excavation to really understand the layers of her character, because she is a character who is somewhat withholding, and is prone to sort of strange thoughts and strange actions and strange impulses, and so it took a lot of, I think, just time with her, and seeing her. She sort of lives in travel, I think, through her characters explored in 3 different contexts: the film festival in Havana that she's attending in the wake of her husband's death. She also, as a sales rep, an elevator sales rep, travels incessantly for her just regular job as an adult. And she was raised as an inn. Her parents were innkeepers in a small inn in North Florida in Jacksonville Beach. So I think actually really the deeper that I sort of moved into these 3 contexts of travel, one that's immediate, one that's more or less immediate, and then one that belongs to the distant past. I mean, I think that was sort of a crucial tool in the excavation process.
Okay. So, I mean, thinking about travel and the way that travel really shapes the book, I mean, it in terms of kind of quite literally where Clare goes. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the many formal elements of the book and the influences, because it's really intricately constructed, right? There's what I've heard you call existential film noir aspect to it, but there's also a way in which formally it has the shape and pushes against the shape of the conventions of horror films. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because and this would involve maybe I knew next to nothing about a lot of what I read in here about horror films and a little bit about The Final Girl. But if you could talk about that language a little bit, because I think one of the things you're up to is also, Claire is both a final girl and she's not, right?
Right. Yeah.
So the bigger question, and then I'll stop talking to let you answer it, is formally how this material took shape with all of those things, all of these very complicated things that you're working with in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's my practice between projects to keep what I call a thought log, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's very uninteresting, just a log of my thoughts. But one of the reasons why I keep it, and specifically why I keep it between projects, is just to see what keeps coming up, and if there are recurring obsessions and preoccupations and concerns, and then if there are, to think, okay, maybe I can read a little bit more deeply in a particular direction, or maybe I'll spend a little bit more time with an idea or a line or an image. And a couple of things kept coming up, and I could see that they kept coming up, but I really could not see how they could be related or could sort of exist together in the same fictional universe. This married couple, Clare and Richard, was one thing that kept recurring in the thought log. Horror films was another. Travel in the context of both work and tourism. I wrote chunks of this book when I myself was traveling a lot and spending a lot of time in hotels and airports and in transit spaces. I find transit spaces so interesting. There's so much human strangeness on display, if we're attuned to it. And there's spaces that are, on the one hand, very, very intimate and also anonymous. And I find that friction super interesting and very evocative and compelling. And it was something that I had started to pay kind of a lot of attention to. If you've been on a long flight and you don't fall asleep but the person next to you falls asleep and they're dreaming, that's an incredibly intimate thing to witness. Yet there is this sort of anonymous silence around it. Like, my sense is it would be a breach of social protocol to shake the person on the shoulder and be like, is it a good dream? Is it a nightmare? Tell me more. We see this kind of strangeness unfolding in front of us, but are sort of socially bound to act like it's not happening. And I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida, which is a part of the state where the economy and culture has been really powerfully shaped by tourism. So that just whole language of tourism, the vocabulary, how we narrate places that we travel to, that has always been of huge interest to me. And one really critical moment in my research where I was reading a lot of film theory, I was working with these characters, and I was also reading scholarly works on tourism and travel too, where I started to notice that it was quite common in some works for the language of scholarly work on tourism to have quite a lot of overlap with cinematic language. So you would see recurring phrases like angles and gazes and lenses and things like that, talking about how people look, how they narrate, and the implications of those qualities of looking and narrating. And that had a tremendous amount of synergy, I found, with cinematic language. And that was one of those early light bulb moments where I started to see, a string that connected this thing to that thing. And I do think travel is so much about looking, and of course, film is so much about looking.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I'm trying to. There's a lot of things I want to ask you, but let me see if I can string these words together. Back to this idea of Claire as a final girl, and can you talk a little bit about final girldom? Because here she's gone. The novel opens with a question, right? Which is, what is she doing in Havana? And it's a question that has answers. She's there for a film festival, and it doesn't have answers. It's a question that is all the richer for that. That it kind of has something that's tugging you along, and then you're satisfied by certain things, but then you're satisfied by not having things answered as well. And she's gone there for the film festival, but she doesn't have her role is as a kind of stand-in for her husband. But then things shift, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the final girl and the way that shifts. I mean, without giving too much away, but your interest in kind of flipping the script, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So the final girl, for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, I mean, to my mind, it was Carol Clover. I think it was her scholarship that, kind of, if not coined the term, sort of brought it into the popular lexicon. But it's for anyone who's not a horror fan in the audience, the final girl is the heroine who's the last surviving character at the end of a horror movie. So Laurie Strode from Halloween, Sidney Prescott from Scream. I could go on, but I won't, etc. And yeah, I mean, so much has been written about the final girl and how I think the gender dynamics with the final girl.
Yeah, I think this is partly what I'm thinking.
Yeah, are complicated in a way that interests me. On the one hand, and I remember watching sort of early. Seeing the first Scream, which was this really, I felt like really made its way into pop culture, as a young person, and being sort of struck by the fact that it was the first time that I could remember seeing a female protagonist in a kind of action movie who was the heroine, and who was the lead figure and the sort of agent of action. At the same time, thinking and reading more deeply into some of those tropes, I do think that there are certain qualities of the final girl. I mean, first of all, horror films still traffic in all kinds of like really damaging stereotypes about women, like. If you don't have sex at all, you'll die. But if you have too much sex, you'll also die.
You're definitely gonna die.
You'll definitely die. And your death will be like extra gruesome just to like punish you a little bit more. So there's this sense that you're, the final girl in some ways is trying to aspire to this sort of puritanical ideal of not being completely unsexy, but not sort of like too sexy at the same time. And also I think, more profoundly that in some ways the final girl really has to embrace patriarchal violence in order to survive. And that's part of what allows her to survive. So, on the one hand, she's this kind of powerful, triumphant figure. On the other hand, the nature of her triumph, I think, is super complicated. And I think one sort of thing that Clover explores in her work is to what degree are the final girl and the killer just sort of two sides of the same coin, that the movement of the film almost brings them sort of like they're closer together than they were at the outset. And I think, for Clare, in the present tense, I mean, she does not have a sort of like a clear antagonist or a menacing force that's, chasing her down alleys or anything like that. So she sort of comes to kind of fulfill both those roles in a way of both final girl and killer potentially. And I think that goes back to the sort of instability of perception and instability of self and identity that you brought up earlier.
One of the things that really thrills me about this book is its investment in uncertainty and in mystery. And so, I mean, when you say about Claire that, or about the final girl, and that Claire does not have sort of the satisfaction or the answer, which is to sort of kill kill the killer. But she's ever exploring through her sort of this atmosphere of grief, all of these unsolvable things. So grief and marriage and solitude, and also the secret self that you mentioned in your reading. And one of the things you and I have talked about a little is this idea of, to back up a little, E.M. Forster talks about the secret life of characters, and then there is perhaps the secret life with a secret life, and I think of Clare as having that kind of having secrets from herself and keeping secrets from us. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about striking that balance in the book. Yeah.
I'm interested in how fiction can move through, the different sort of modes and layers of the self. So we have the public, sort of our most front-facing self, maybe the person we are when we go to work, or the person like we are right now, in a public sphere. We have the private self, which is the self that we are sort of aware as our private self, but maybe it's the self that we don't expose as readily or as easily, depending on, the vagaries of personality and so on. And then there's the secret self. And I think of that, and then, to take it even level further, the secret self within the secret self, start to get very circular here, which I think of as being the part of ourself that baffles even us. When we have those stray thoughts, when we do those strange things, and we're like, where did that come from? Why did I do that? And I think ideally for me, both as a writer and as a reader, fiction is sort of always traveling that spectrum of selfhood, where we're getting to know the front-facing self and the private self, but also the secret self and the secret self and the secret self. And I think that's, for me, that is where the most sort of charged and interesting material comes from. And ultimately, I think a lot of what Claire's dealing with does dwell in the realm of the irresolvable, and I think that's a part of why I write. Those questions that can't be answered in a clean way. They can be explored, they can be defined, they can be illuminated, but they can't necessarily be settled. Here's the last word on that. Here's the last word on marriage, solitude, grief, and death.
It's not easy math.
Yeah, it's not easy math, or maybe it's non-existent math. There's a reason why these subjects, preoccupy writer after writer. The equation has yet to be solved. So, I think part of what compels me to write is to live in those irresolvable spaces and to try and bring shape to them. And I feel like my ambition is to try and name that material in the most precise language available to me, which is a different ambition than saying I want to sort of settle or solve it or resolve it in a complete and definitive way. That said, there are a couple of mystery subplots. There's an actress at the film festival that goes missing. There's a white box that Claire's carrying with her, and you don't know the contents for some time. But I did decide at a certain point that a few of these more minor concrete mysteries would be solved. And there was actually sort of great pleasure in that, and kind of figuring out, that did feel like math that could be figured out. So you do eventually learn what the missing actress has been up to. You do eventually learn what's in the white box, and the significance of what's in the white box. And so it was also pleasurable to create some rock solid sort of counterpoints to all of the liminal ambiguity.
Well, it's all, for me as a reader, there was the satisfaction of having those smaller mysteries not solved, but there was a kind of punctuation, right? But I also felt that my attention was being drawn by you to something much kind of much more elusive and seductively elusive, which is Clare thinking and searching on the page in a really, really interesting way. And I want to kind of get back to this idea of seeing. There's a Paul Eluard line, the poet Paul Eluard. There is another life, but it's in this one. And I've thought of that for many years, but I often think of it when I read your work because I think that's something you're really interested in. And one of the things I've heard you say that I really appreciate is that the way we see the world is relative, right? You know, in other words, you know, one person's surreality is just another crocodile in your backyard in Florida. So I thought, you know, if you could talk a little bit about sort of the different ways, both the different modes of seeing, but also sort of the strangeness in the book, because there's a porousness between reality, dreams, movies, hallucinations, the living, the dead, and so yeah. So back to ways of seeing.
Yeah, I mean, it is true about the nature of reality being subjective. As someone who grew up in Florida and then moved to up north for graduate school, and I would write these stories in which alligators featured prominently because I grew up on a lake and they were everywhere. And then my peers would be like, "You're a surrealist," and I'm like, what? But it's an ever shifting landscape. I think, I mean, that porousness was definitely intentional, and I think particularly because of the rupture that Clare experiences in terms of seeing her husband that she believed to be dead in this place that she's traveled to. Suggests some measure of porousness or distortion. There's a novel that I really love called The Naked Eye by a writer named Yoko Tawada. It's a wonderful book. And in this novel, it's about a woman who is visiting Germany to participate in a youth conference. This is like pre-fall of Berlin Wall. And she's abducted by a German man. This all happens in maybe like 4 pages. It's like right just the beginning of the book. And the rest of the novel is what happens after. And she bounces around to a bunch of places in Europe. And she ends up in Paris where she stays for a period of time. And she becomes obsessed with French film, and she starts spending a lot of time, like the movie theaters become a sort of safe zone for her, and she starts spending a lot of time in these theaters. And the kind of narrative arc of that movie is that the fictive world that's taking shape on the screen and the life that she's actually living sort of collapse into one. And so by the end of the book, she's been sort of folded into the world of the screen. And I find that to be, I mean, that's an extreme example, but I do find that to be seductive about movies. Like there is something so immediate about seeing, I mean, I think maybe like I'm a very visual person too. I mean, there is something so immediate about seeing this world. And if it's a compelling film or a rich film, this really rich and compelling world unfolding right in front of you. And it's like right there, you know, I have had that feeling in movies where I could just stand up from my seat and like walk through the screen, you know? And so that resonated with me powerfully when I read The Naked Eye. And that did, I think, inform the shape that this novel takes, where there's sort of worlds within worlds within worlds. And then what would happen if they began to kind of collapse into one another. And there's a certain blurring that happens maybe if we're dwelling in cinematic landscapes. I think also, you know, grief, like especially if it's of a sudden or extreme nature, can be very distorting, where the way that we've been tracking our life, the way we've been understanding our life, the rules that we thought made sense just don't make sense anymore. It doesn't add up anymore. Everything is turned inside out. And that's another sort of blurring, another kind of distortion. So there are all these kind of transit zones and liminal spaces that Clare has been moving through, both before Richard's death, but particularly in the aftermath. And I was curious to know what would happen if the borders between these spaces started to soften, and what if they started to sort of melt into each other?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really powerful book about that the violence and the derangement, which is a word I think that gets used in the novel, of grief. And so I want to swerve just a little bit to make sure to cover everything. Oh wait, I'm going to go back because it has to do with grief and one of the ways in which grief takes shape cinematically. There's a conversation there's a kind of ongoing conversation about horror films and in particular the movie She's There to See. And I wondered if this is both a kind of process question and a question to do with the ways in which grief manifests itself. But could you talk a little bit about the movie you invented, and then also perhaps the movie that it's based on, because I think it'll give us a way into talking a little bit about Cuba and your interest in Cuba and in placing the novel there.
Yeah, for sure. So the movie within the novel was loosely inspired by a Cuban horror movie called Juan of the Dead, which came out in 2011. And it was written about and sort of hailed as critics by the first Cuban horror movie, which caught my interest because Cuba has a very rich cinematic history. There's a wonderful animated horror series called Vampires in Havana. So I think always feel tempted to add like non-animated horror film, but that doesn't quite roll off the tongue as readily. And so that provided the kind of bare bones inspiration for the film within the novel. And then I borrowed from other movies and also just made stuff up. Made stuff up too. But that was when I was a novelist. Who would think? But when I was, moving through the thought log and writing about horror films and researching and sort of looking and thinking in different directions, that was a movie that I came upon, and that sort of created additional synergy between subject and place.
Well, and there's also a way in which that movie, the way it's described, I mean, it has a kind of political meaning, right? That the zombie movie isn't just a zombie movie, and it seems to me there's a way in which you're getting at the ways that sort of dystopias or horror can kind of get at subjects that can't be addressed head on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one thing that's really interesting about genre is that I think it's less threatening to people, including censors in particular, because in this particular movie, there's a lot of political commentary, a lot of very loaded social commentary. It's very irreverent. It's gory. It's really funny. As the title suggests, it's in the sort of Shaun of the Dead, vein. And it won an award from the annual film festival in Havana. So it's interesting to think, where films are still banned or not shown because they are judged by the government and by government censors as being too not sufficiently patriotic. So it's interesting to me. The way genre makes us sort of more susceptible to ideas or narratives that we might be resistant to otherwise, or it seems less threatening. I remember, this is like kind of terrifying, but I had family members who were really sort of in the 2008 election, they were kind of on the fence about who to vote for and they weren't sure. And they were really like changed by the Tina Fey's impersonation of Sarah Palin, which is troubling on a number of levels. However, it does sort of, but I think in some ways it was like a criticism that they weren't willing to hear when it was direct, but they could hear it in the context of comedy, because the first thing it did was make them laugh. And then once they were laughing, they were sort of disarmed and they could absorb the critique. And so I think that's something that interests me a lot about genre, the way it can disarm us. And then, I'm sort of, Get Out was very popular. Like every white person I saw loved Get Out. And I wonder if it was sort of not a horror movie, but it's like, let's go see a movie about systemic racism and the violence of white complicity. If they would have been like that sounds great. Let's do it. Like maybe. Right. I would like to think so optimistically. Yeah. But I think again, I would imagine that the fact of the genre got people into that theater that might not have gone under different, a different context.
Right. Sort of familiar tropes that are allowing these other bigger issues to be clarified. One of the things, just the last question really has to do with the humor in the book, because it's something I really, really appreciated. And, it's a book that's very self-aware. And there were a lot of moments that I thought, oh, this is kind of the author saying, trust me, I know what I'm doing. And one of those moments was someone says to Claire, Americans love to have their little crises in countries not their own. And, one of the things that is both funny and also I think humor allows you to deliver this message is the meditation Claire does on her own kind of Americanness abroad, and I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
I certainly, speaking from the realm of influence, a big influence for me is the travel novel. There's so many abroad novels or travel novels, not necessarily from an American point of view, but just speaking more generally, that I really love the books that have meant a great deal to me. And so it's a form. I think of this novel as being like a hybrid book in a lot of ways. Sure. It's part sort of psychological horror, part travel novel, part detective's quest, also very much a sort of character study in a novel about marriage and intimacy and instability of trust and knowing and all of those things. But one question that I was, interested in exploring was the sort of, the American abroad incarnation of the travel novel, and particularly the white American abroad incarnation of the travel novel. It's very fraught and it has a lot of baggage. Yeah. It comes with a lot of baggage, and sort of one, question that I was writing into is how can this form be sort of pushed? How can it be reimagined or reshaped? How can it be sort of taken apart and put back together in like a different sort of structure? And that, I think, of course, it's up to readers to determine how successful I was in that or not. But it was certainly an ambition that I was moving forward with and something that I was thinking about a lot.
Well, I think we're coming close to. Okay, so well, I just want to bring it back to the complexity of Clare, because I think that is sort of one of the ways. It's to me, the texture of her consciousness, the complexity of that is what allows you to bring in all of these influences, to bring in the theory of the fantastic. It's almost as though by allowing us to be with her as she's thinking, she can then sort of explore all of these various subjects, and it's coming through her, through the character. And so back to this idea of the complexity of selfhood. I think that's the deep thrill of this book, is kind of the mystery of her particular inimitable consciousness. So
thank you.
Thank you. So questions from the audience.
Question?
Well, my question is a very obvious question. I'm sure you're totally prepared for this one. So,
okay.
If I don't ask it, somebody else will ask it. So. And that is, did you write this book with the express intent for it to be adapted for the screen? And let me sort of expand on that a little bit. And if so, is it likely that it could be done as a movie in the way that you would sort of most like to see it done as a movie. And so, in other words, if you do see it in your mind as on the screen someday, are you concerned that the subtleties of for the reasons you wrote it and so forth, that they're hard to get across on the screens?
Yeah, it's so funny that you asked that question, because it's a natural question, right? Because the book is so much about film.
And books. So.
And yeah, but I just did an interview with someone who sort of posed maybe like a similar question in an opposite way, where he said, was it intentionally ironic that you wrote a book that's largely about film that could not possibly be adapted?
That's actually a better way to put it. It's more of much more of a challenge.
Yeah, which is to say, I mean, it is such an interior book that I think, I mean, anything's possible. But I think that it would be, it would pose some pretty immediate challenges to adapt. I think, though, my most honest answer to that question is, I work on the page and I love film, but that world also at the same time is sort of a beautiful mystery to me. I have actually a short story that's in the process of being adapted right now, and I read the script because it was important for me to feel like the work was in trustworthy hands. But I don't need to do anything else with the project. I'm happy for it to sort of take its own life, because it really is such a different medium. And I think I teach, there's a story called Story of Your Life by a writer named Ted Chiang that was adapted into the movie Arrival, which some of you might know. And it's a beautiful movie and it's a beautiful story, but the story takes place, this sounds impossible, which is why it's so exciting to teach. Time is sort of simultaneous, so past and present and future are all occurring at the same time, and you think, how on earth would you adapt that? And the screenwriters figured out the puzzle, and it's a really beautiful film. It also necessarily has a completely different structure than the story, and so I think maybe it's a puzzle that an interested screenwriter could figure out, but my puzzle will be the next novel.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have another question. I think that, Maud, you were going to talk a little bit before I cut you off about Cuba. So I just wanted to address that, and the kind of was the relationship with Cuba and your process around that. Did you have this set and then kind of transfer it there? And what was kind of the genesis of the setting and your kind of research into it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So my process, I would say it was an organic connection, and did sort of rise from the thought log that's come up a few times. While all of these things were sort of germinating and intersecting, I became very interested in how after President Obama loosened the travel restrictions to Cuba, all of a sudden Havana was in like every travel magazine, and every travel blogger was writing about Havana. I mean, the island generally, but Havana a little bit more specifically. And I was really interested in how the place was being narrated, what was being highlighted, what was being left out of the narrative altogether, and the sort of implications of those presences and those absences. And there was certain, even though Orlando and Havana are not at all comparable contexts for a million different reasons, I did feel like that was a sort of conversation where I had a point of entry, so to speak. So that I think was was a particular connection. So it was really like, if you imagine like the serial killer's den that they discover at the end of the horror movie, and you have these different pieces, and then you have all of these strings connecting them, that's essentially what my thought log looked like. or the detective, either way. But that's, it wasn't so much like there was one reason for this and one reason for that and one reason for that, but it was sort of this kind of constellation of things coming together and bumping against each other over time. Yeah.
My question's about detail, and I've always been impressed with the detail in your writing. I use a couple passages from your first novel to teach detail, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how detail is almost more important when you're writing books that aren't as concrete. You have this book that's covering so many different levels, but then there's these really beautiful passages that absolutely ground the reader in a very concrete place. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how that's important or why you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to be, partly because I am sort of just naturally a kind of visual person. I think I love writing that's visceral, that's connected to the earth, that's connected to the body, that has that tactile sort of touchable quality to it. So I think to a certain degree that probably just grows out of a natural, or orientation of personality. But I think also, when you are writing work that is collapsing sort of the boundaries between these different worlds, I mean, you need to be clear. You need to be clear about something, and one thing that you can be clear about is just, where the characters are physically and what's happening sort of in their bodies. And so I very much aspire to create a really tactile visual language for this book, a language of sort of bodily responses, patterns of objects and visuals that could kind of recur and transform and mutate and take new shapes, but that would be ever present. I think sometimes, what I see with student work that aspires to live in the liminal ambiguity, but it's like the sentence level writing is also really vague and really hazy, and you just don't know where you are. And then there's sort of like, oh, but I meant for it all to be vague, and you're like, well, okay. But there's sort of no place for your reader to kind of get a foothold. So that was, and that sort of circles back to a question that you were asking, Maud, about kind of balance between, what's going to be firm and concrete and stable and what will be intentionally unstable. And one place where I was very conscious of trying to create a lot of stability was just with the sort of physical tactile world. And that's something, my favorite horror movies are very visceral. And I think, I loved this Australian movie called The Babadook, which maybe, has anyone seen? Okay. I see some nods of recognition. And that's a movie where, a mother and a son who are under psychological duress for various reasons become menaced by this presence called the Babadook. But also, I think the film brilliantly never really reveals the full shape of the creature. And so there is that sort of ambiguity about whether is this something that's truly setting upon them from the outside world, or is this something that the characters have created or generated to some degree, or is it possible that it's both at the same time? Like, that ambiguity is never pierced. And I think we can sort of release questions as viewers of, is the Babadook real or is the Babadook not real? Because the visceral impact, no matter where it's coming from, of the disturbance is so powerful. And so that's something I was conscious of also, that my ambition was, if you can make the quality of impact powerful and visceral enough, it can encourage readers to release questions of, is this real, is this not real, and just sort of be with the force of the moment.
It seems to me also that because this is a book that is so occupied with grief, that Claire, her physicality moving through this world is so important, because she's not a zombie, she's not a ghost, she's a person who has had this violent trauma happen to her, and so all of the sensory details that you bring into play with her character are so key in terms of kind of making the more abstract philosophical questions deeply felt.
Yes, that was the hope that that this sort of the blood and guts, so to speak, could anchor the film theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think we're all set. Thank you so much.
Okay.
This was a really
Thank you.
wonderful conversation.